The early Renaissance is considered one of the most crucial and dynamic periods in Western art. Wealthy 14th century citizens commissioned extravagant works, spurring Florentine artists to experiment with new materials and turn to New Testament stories of Christ's life and the lives of the saints for inspiration. In this episode of Catholic Focus, join us as we delve into the world of 14th century Florentine art. Hello and welcome to Catholic Focus. My name is Cheridan Sanders. I'm pleased to welcome to our Salt and Light studios Sasha Suda. She's the Assistant Curator of European Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and she's here to speak with us about their latest exhibition. It's called Revealing the Early Renaissance, Stories and Secrets in Florentine Art. Thanks, Sasha, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me today.
So this is an extraordinary exhibit in that you've got over 90 pieces, more than 40 international lenders. Tell us how this exhibition came to be.
Well, it's a great question, and probably my answer will be unexpected in that it takes almost a decade to put a show like this together, and it starts, perhaps less surprisingly so, with a small idea. Art historian or then assistant curator of manuscripts at the Getty Museum saying, I'm really interested in Pacino de Bonneguida. He's an artist whose work we've just acquired, that's almost a decade ago, and I want to know more about him. And so starts to work on Pacino de Bonneguida, an artist that we don't talk about in the art historical canon. And all of a sudden, he decides he wants to do a Pacino show. He's since moved on from the Getty. Another curator, Christine Shaka, took the project on, the Pacino project. And the Getty thought, well, this needs to be bigger than just Pacino. Clearly, if Pacino's doing exciting things in Florence, so are the rest of the artists in Florence. And what's the untold story of Florence? At which point the Getty partners with the Art Gallery of Ontario to broaden the story, and we built the show that came here today, which has a roster of probably more than a dozen artists, some anonymous, others not anonymous, who really worked together to recreate the history of art and to launch the Renaissance, really, which is the story we're telling.
Right, and some of these pieces have never traveled before. How did that all come to be? I mean, you've got pieces from the Vatican museums, North America, Europe. How did this all come to be?
Well, it all ties in with sort of the whole beginning of the show. When you decide that you're going to tell a story, in our case, a story that hasn't been told before, because we've all heard the story that Giotto gave birth to the Renaissance, but not that all these other artists also contributed to the movement, then you have to sort of go and pound the pavement, quite literally. Going to Florence, going to Milan, to the Travoltiana Library, going to Rome, to the Vatican Library, and to the Vatican Museum, and to places in Germany, France. I mean, it goes on. And you need to say, okay, this is the idea that we're working on. We think it's an important idea, and through an exhibition, we think that we can really bring this idea to life and tell this story, which hopefully will change the way people see the history of art and the city of Florence. Are you in? And interestingly, a lot of people are in right away because we were asking about artists that weren't necessarily their sort of blockbuster artists. In other cases, it took years to get them to agree to lend to our show because someone like Giotto di Bondone hasn't necessarily been seen with Pacino in a sort of equalizing light before. And so doing that took some convincing. But as you have these conversations and carry out these negotiations, the story changes a little bit too. So what you end up with is a reflection of all those negotiations and relationships that come along the way.
Right. Can you tell me what happens once it's crated up and then packaged off and received here? Like, what are some of the concerns when you're transporting treasures, really?
Getting people to agree to lend is the beginning of that story, in that no one wants to lend manuscripts because they're on parchment, so animal skin, and the pigments in them are often very vulnerable to light, so they have a tendency to fade over time, and parchment itself expands and contracts, so there's a risk always that it'll expand, contract, and you'll lose paint. The same is true of wooden panels. And so when you get them to agree, they put them in the crate and you bring them here, Then they have to acclimatize so that this kind of expansion and contraction doesn't happen. And then you really have a very small window of time to install them into the climate-controlled cases where they, again, won't experience that kind of change in climate.
How is the exhibit set up in terms of its, is it chronological or is it thematic? How did you decide to put these pieces together?
We felt that really the center of the story for us was the city, that it was the city with its variety of audiences, the church, the various orders, the new emerging classes that created an environment of such artistic variety and diversity. So we start with the city in the first gallery. And so you enter into a gallery where you see a large reproduction of the city from an engraving, and then two works, a book from Lawrenciana, which shows you an insider's view of Florence, and one from the British Library, where it now is, which shows an outsider's view of Florence. And then the next gallery introduces you to some of these artists that were part of this story, that responded to Florence's demand for more art and different art. And then you walk into a huge space, which for those of your viewers who have seen Frida and Diego exhibition, was 3 galleries, which we've turned into 1 gallery to evoke a sense of Santa Croce, a large, airy church with lots of circulation and with lots of visual things calling for your attention. Once you've come out of that big space, you're immersed in a very sort of small, intimate space, which is the room dedicated to the Laudario of San Agnese, which is a manuscript I think we'll talk a little bit more about, but where you see the individual leaves, no labels on the wall, and just you hear the music and you see the images. And then the last 2 galleries, instead of focusing on the context, we try to bring out some of the big themes. You know, what is it from this art that resonates today? So you enter a gallery dedicated to storytelling, sort of this art is the beginning of the graphic novel, and then the last gallery is dedicated to the workshop and artistic practice and making, kind of trying to bring it back full circle to today, connecting these works that are over 700 years old to today's artistic practices.
Okay, paint me a picture of what life was like at that time.
Florence, as many know, and perhaps some don't know, has very deep devotional underpinnings. It's a city that really gave rise to the begging orders, the mendicant orders. So in the 1200s, it's already sort of on the map, but really from a devotional point of view, I would say, it's not an economic center yet. In 1252, though, they bring into circulation the florin, which is a standardized currency. It's a gold coin that you can trade and it won't lose value. And so it becomes a banking center. And so, of course, all of those devotional underpinnings remain, and you have this really vibrant devotional and spiritual community in the city, but you also have an emerging banking class and merchant class, and it's these people who sort of build their own church, like Santa Croce, and they have huge altarpieces made for it in a way to promote themselves alongside the church in a sort of partnership with the church. But then you have incredible things being made for the convents and for the monasteries, which are very much still thriving in the city. And so it's an interesting place because you have a sort of rising material luxury culture, but one that's thriving alongside a very sort of rigorous and traditional devotional culture as well.
Let's talk about one of the cornerstones of the exhibit, the Laudario of San Agnese.
The book was made for a confraternity, and that's a group of people who would come together. They would, of course, sing hymns of praise based on the church calendar, but they also, as we're finding in the illuminations, talked about all sorts of things, likely science and other sort of humanistic things that were popping out in the discourse at that time. So what we've done is we've taken this book, and we've reunited the pages to sort of recreate the book in a way. And so what you end up with is this beautiful room where we reunite the pages with one another, but we also reunite the pages with the music. Probably for the first time in 500 years, a group from New York called Lionheart, a vocal ensemble, not only did they sing the music that survives in the book, but they also transcribed it themselves from the notation in the manuscript so that it's playable again and singable again, which is quite amazing.
Very interesting. We now take a moment to enjoy an excerpt from the Laudario performed by the Lionheart Vocal Ensemble. what is the Florentine person's concerns, and how is that reflected in the art?
It's a great question. So it depends which Florentine person you ask. But if you're talking about one of these, newly wealthy bankers or merchants or wool traders or wool manufacturers, they're probably loving the beautiful clothes that they're wearing, which is likely made out of textiles that have been imported from the East or perhaps even made in Florence. And they're enjoying this new material culture of theirs. But there's probably some concern about what that means for them in terms of their fate, because they've grown up in a culture and very much are part of a number of generations of under the Catholic Church, of being part of the Catholic Church, where it's unclear where that will lead to. And so there's a deep anxiety and ambivalence about that. So there becomes sort of an obsession with, for example, purgatory. And Dante writes the Divine Comedy right at this moment, and purgatory is sort of one of the main themes in that book. It's an interesting moment because I think you can see in the art that there's a bit of an anxiety, a bit of an ambivalence, a desire to connect the world, this new world that these people find themselves in and are creating for themselves, and the divine or ethereal world that is their ideal still.
And interesting enough, you've got a copy, an illuminated manuscript of Dante's Divine Comedy in the exhibit.
So Dante is an interesting figure because, of course, he goes into exile, and the Florentines aren't huge fans of his because he's a huge critic of the Florentine culture at the time, and he's the one who's really saying through the Divine Comedy that it's this new behavior, this new culture, which ultimately is going to land you in a place you don't want to be. And in a way, the Divine Comedy is, well, in a very simplistic way, it's a reflection of that. It's sort of a guidebook to guide you up to the top of the paradisical mountain. And so that's something people are reading. It's something people love. He, of course, passes away having just finished the poem, and people are just, it's a bestseller. Everyone had a copy and had read it. And of course, they wanted illustrated copies, but he didn't illustrate the book. So they took these copies to manuscript illuminators, and they said, we want you to paint the Divine Comedy images in our books. And so the painters really had to make up their own images for this story, which is quite exceptional because prior to this, much of the religious imagery in the show has a model from they're copying, but probably changing the setting, but sort of the iconography is pretty standard. But in the Divine Comedy, it's totally new, and that's really amazing. And the copy in the show that's from the Travoltiana is one that's the earliest surviving copy of Dante's Divine Comedy that has images in it.
You mentioned icons, and if we could just talk a little bit about how Florentine people would have related to sacred art in that respect, and how we see some movement away from these traditional representations.
Well, it's a really good question because, of course, if I were to give you sort of the simplistic view, I would say in the Middle Ages, there's a tendency because theologically there's a real focus, for example, on the Old Testament, on sort of this notion of kingship, and really the art becomes something that separates the ethereal world from the earthly world. You see Christ, he's flat, symmetrical, he's staring at you, he's on the cross, his eyes are open, he's triumphant over death. Well, you'll go through the show, he's not triumphant over death in terms of the representation. His eyes are closed, his body's limp on the cross, blood streaming out of his body, and that's in a way a much more naturalistic or realistic way of depicting Christ being crucified. It's something that allows us to relate to his suffering. And that represents a sort of general shift towards portraying these figures as people who could be part of their everyday life, of the patrons who ordered these works of art. And so in some cases, it almost feels like it's a little too close, that martyr or that Mary could easily be mistaken for a wealthy woman, insofar as she's wearing a beautiful dress and she's wearing an incredible mantle made of fur-lined silk. And you think to yourself, well, what is this sort of newfound interest? Well, okay, so it's theological, but there's also this really desire to pull it into their reality so that they can almost feel like when they speak to this image or they pray to this image that it's this intercessor on earth with them. ones that's bridging the gap between the sort of, again, the heavenly and the earthly realms. Then you get some that have very realistic bodies. You see, for example, there's a great Dottie triptych where you see the Virgin's, you see her breasts and what seems to be her pregnant belly even underneath the dress. And that feels very real. It's sort of a step towards, human representation. But in other cases, that realism is expressed in different ways. So, for example, Pacino de Bonaguida paints a crucifixion with a black background rather than a gold background. And that shift to black, it's the first ever black background in a crucifixion scene, we think is an attempt to really show the true sort of literal representation of what happens after Christ dies on the cross, which is that the whole world turns dark, according to the biblical text. So there's a different kind of realism taking place there, sort of literary realism versus a visual realism. So it's interesting.
In terms of the color schemes, what do we see and what sort of techniques are developing during this time?
I think what we were most interested in was how fluently the painters worked on both manuscripts and panel paintings. So typically we find manuscript painters work in their workshops, they do their own thing, and panel painters do the same. They're parts of separate guilds. But this time we're seeing that they're either working together or working in both different media. So we did a lot of scientific testing on the pigments and found that, yeah, indeed, they were sharing pigments. And in some cases, it means probably Pacino was in love with this certain yellow pigment. And even though he knew it was not the best idea to use it on wooden panel that would be exposed all the time because it's not very robust, he does it anyways. And now it doesn't exist for us anymore, but it exists in his books.
How do you deal with deteriorating art, and how do you know what it looked like before and what it's supposed to look like?
The real key to that question is manuscripts. And I think it's rare to show panel paintings and manuscripts together. Manuscripts are kind of hard to show because they are, you can only show one opening and they're sort of in cases that aren't as easy to see from across the room. But they also live most of their life closed, in libraries, hidden away. And so they tend to maintain really excellent condition in terms of the pigments inside. So we can really get a sense of the original aesthetic of a work, of a palette, when we open a page of a manuscript that hasn't been faded over time. And so we've actually used the manuscripts in the case of this show to help us understand some of the works that underwent conservation in preparation for the show. Interestingly enough, there are a few works in the show that have not had to have any work at all, that are in absolutely pristine condition. And then there are some works that we've included purposefully that have had a fairly rough life. And that helps you also appreciate the ones that are in great condition. But I'll leave it to the audience to go and check out which those are.
Right. What can we learn about these Florentine artists? What is their contribution to Western art?
Fascinatingly, I think we uncovered one major thing, which is these artists were making way more art than we could have ever assumed. Once you start to pool together all the works that are attributed to Pacino de Bonaguida, you realize that he could not have been working alone, and that he had to have a very, very sort of tight roster of people who worked with him in his style. They contributed not just to the stylistic change, and I think for Pacino, he adapted to sort of this changing mode of art towards realism while staying with a kind of mystical feeling, and one that really served very devotional audiences, for example, in a monastery or in a convent. But really, he must have done some very innovative things in terms of organizing his workshop as a true business person.
We see this development of the artist workshop, and how is that sort of different from what had been before?
I think one thing is something we touched on a second ago, which is that artists were working in a sort of a variety of media. So a patron who wanted a book and a panel and so on could go to a single artist and say, can you do this for me? So that helps, but it also makes the workshop practice much more sort of difficult for us to understand. And I think really at the end of the day, we're just left with a lot more questions than we started with. These artists were clearly far more sophisticated than we gave them credit for before. And the Italians, and still are, historically we call these artists the Italian primitives, because they're really the beginning, the sort of forerunners of the Renaissance. But what we're finding is that they're clearly not primitive in any way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Sasha Suda is the Assistant Curator of European Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and she was speaking to us today about their latest exhibition, revealing the early Renaissance stories and secrets in Florentine art. Today's footage was provided by the Art Gallery of Ontario. Special thanks to Bernstein Artists and the Lionheart Vocal Ensemble for their musical contribution to today's show. And that's all for tonight. If you'd like to share your thoughts with us, write to us at focus@sultanlighttv.org. That's all for tonight. Good night and God bless.